Hi there, Rudyard Griffiths, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this day 3 of our election coverage. The 2025 federal election is underway. And as the top of each and every one of these programs, I want to get you caught up to date on some of the latest news. So where are the leaders today? Well, Mark Carney is in Windsor with an announcement this morning. Pierre Poilievre in Hamilton, then off to Quebec. Jagmeet Singh also in Hamilton, Southern Ontario. Clearly key for all these parties as the race kicks off. Policy announcements, we like to focus on them here at the Hub. So we had a seniors announcement today from Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, basically a kind of more generous treatment of seniors' abilities to earn income tax-free. They get an additional $10,000. They also get a couple more years to avoid converting their RRSPs into RIFs. So clearly an effort to court the conservative senior vote. With the Liberals, we had an announcement this morning from Mark Carney on the last mile. So again, kind of reiterating pledges that he's made, in fact, prior to the campaign about getting Canadian infrastructure and natural resources out of the ground and to world markets. And from the NDP, we don't have the announcement yet, but we also think it will be, if reports are correct, focused on seniors, and we'll be covering all this throughout the day at the Hub. Finally, just want to give you a snapshot of the latest poll out in the last 24 hours by Main Street Research. Bit of a tightening here by Main Street between the Conservatives and Liberals, but boy, look at that NDP vote down to 6%, 1% off the block for the NDP as a national party. Pretty remarkable numbers. Let's bring in Sean Speer, editor-at-large and co-founder of The Hub, to talk a little bit about these poll numbers that we're looking at off the top of the program. Sean, what do you make of this seeming inability of the NDP to kind of climb out of the single digits in the early days of this campaign?
Yeah, isn't this the one of the biggest storylines of this campaign, Roger? I worked in the 2011 national campaign of the Conservative Party. Of course, the one election in which Stephen Harper won a majority government. I'm not saying that that there's causation there, just saying that I was part of that campaign. That year, Roger, the year in which the Conservatives won a majority, if I recall correctly, their final share of the popular vote was 38%, precisely where Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives sit today. The big difference, of course, was in that election, the Democrats performed strongly. And so that 38% on the part of the Conservatives just proved to be far more efficient than it would be under a scenario in which the NDP is in single digits. And so apart from Pierre Poilievre offering a bus or something like that to Jagmeet Singh, and the onus will be on the Conservatives to try to push their numbers up as high as they can if they want to be able to compete against the Liberals, in which we essentially have a two-party race in most parts of the country.
But Sean, surely the NDP is looking at Carney as a perfect foil. I mean, this is the archetypal banker villain that this party was built to oppose, built to fight. Carney's talking about pipelines. He's talking about big investments in Canada's energy and resource extraction. I thought these were all, again, key issues that NDP voters would oppose in the name of a kind of climate agenda, in the name of the policies that they espouse, which are not friendly to the pro-business kind of outlook and history and CV. I mean, Brookfield Asset Management is $1 billion basically, in Wall Street investment fund.
Yes.
Why can't the NDP get traction here?
Yeah, I'd say two things in response. First of all, Mark Carney seems to be pulling off a pretty extraordinary magic trick, shifting his party to the right, at least relative to where it's been over the past decade or so, and consolidating left-wing vote. I suspect Justin Trudeau and others around him would like to know what was behind that magic, because they themselves would have drawn on it over the past several years. The second point, though, is a good segue to our next conversation. The New Democrats, I think, are going through something of an identity crisis, and it's not just in this campaign. It's been something that's been happening for a long time. As you say, Roger, the party's roots are in the trade union movement, and in representing workers and worker interests across the country, it seems to me the NDP has moved away from that ethos, instead been animated by a set of propositions about culture and identity and so on. And that has, in a way, broken its relationship with traditional labor. And it's actually the conservatives who are seizing on it. You mentioned that Polyev was in Hamilton last night. I'm sure you saw the size of the rally. I mean, the idea that conservatives could have something like 4,500 people out in Hamilton would have been an anathema to most political analysts, little more than a decade ago. And so, who better to talk to about all this, Rudyard, than a Hamiltonian himself?
Yeah.
Uh, we're glad to have Brian Dykema, the president of Cardis, to join us today to talk both about what played out in Hamilton, but more importantly, this issue, Rudyard, that we've been following a lot at the Hub over the past several months, which is the political realignment in a world in which the voter composition of the different parties is evolving, and conservatives are increasingly competitive with blue collar and working class voters.
Yeah. Well, Brian, welcome onto the program. Maybe to begin, Brian, if you could tell us a little bit just about what Cardis is for some of our viewers and listeners tuning into the show on the Hub podcast feed. What are you doing at Cardis? What's your mission and mandate?
Sure. We're a public policy think tank, Rudyard. We, like other think tanks, do research on a variety of files, do labor, education, health, religious freedom. We're a think tank that works out of the Christian tradition, the Christian social tradition. That's a little more common when it comes to politics in places like Europe and the Netherlands and France and Germany, but something that I think is appropriate and needed here. And particularly when it comes to labor, it's a tradition, I think, that has unique things to say in the Canadian environment where labor is undergoing a bit of a switch when it's with its political alignment, and also just in terms of what it's there for and what's the point of organized labor. So it's a little bit about what we do, and thanks for having me on the show.
And just, Brian, just to make this point, because we want to understand for our viewers, why it's important to hear your voice on the question of labor and where labor is going politically in Canada. Cardis has roots, right? Deep roots in various aspects of the labor movement in Canada. So maybe just give us that backstory too.
For sure. I mean, I'll maybe just tell it through my own story, which is that I used to be a labor representative. I used to be a union goon. I didn't break anybody's ankles, but I did negotiate some good deals. And so I used to work for an independent union, the largest independent private sector union in Canada. It's called the CLAC. And called the Christian Labor Association of Canada. Represents about 60,000 plus or minus, given the business cycle, workers in construction, in transportation. I used to every now and then, when I lived in Ottawa, go in the back of the garbage trucks and just get worked like a mule by our fellow members. Healthcare, and so there's a sense in which the work that Cardis does emerges out of a unique labor tradition, and one that is dominant in Europe. If you look at the European scene, there are 2 or 3 different types of unions. You have the more left-wing unions associated with socialist parties. Then you have Christian democratic unions that tend to be center-right. They're a little bit they'll go depending on which way the political winds go and their interests are aligned. And then you have a little bit more of the liberal unions, those that are more sort of free market oriented. And so the Christian democratic unions, the tradition out of which I come, is the roots of Cardis, and it used to be called the Work Research Foundation. And so that was where we got our start. And I think in the Canadian environment, we've seen a little bit of that tradition change the nature of the labor movement, particularly in the construction sector. And that's the sector that, as Sean was alluding to, is rallying almost full stop behind the Conservatives these days.
Well, in that vein, we've had 2 major endorsements from trade unions of the Conservative Party just in the past 48 hours or so. For a lot of our listeners and viewers, that will seem counterintuitive, Brian. Why don't you talk a bit about this broader trend of the political realignment and the growing shift of labor unions and their members from the left to the right, not just in Canada, but around the Anglo-American world? What are some of the factors that you think are behind that shift? And then maybe later on in the conversation, we can get into the policy implications and of course, the political ones.
Yeah, I think in many ways, Sean, what's happening with these announcements that the UA UA is the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union. They introduced Pierre Polyev in Hamilton and downtown East Side in Hamilton, down the mountain, huge crowds. And I think what's happening here is actually the executive of these unions are actually catching up with where their members have been for years. When I worked with the union 15, 20 years ago, most of the workers were voting blue or at least tending blue. And what's happening is the executive is finally catching up with it. And I think in some sense, they're catching up with it because they've been left alone, like you said, by the NDP, which used to represent the sort of working class, agrarian plus workers, used to be the sort of core vote for the NDP. And you'd see that in places like Thunder Bay, you'd see that in Saskatchewan and so on. But the NDP, and this is the story of the sort of realignment across the world, the Anglosphere at least, and it's happening in other places too, is that the left has tended to sort of respond to a constituency which is almost entirely public sector, academic, and sort of cultural elites, and the sort of idea-driven, ideology-driven, you might even say, and a little bit less removed with the sort of we're sticking up for this person who's living their life. And there was a sense at that point, it was like the worker was just respected for the worker. They understood that they got a family, their own beliefs, and so on, and they were respecting their economic interest and trying to build structures that actually helped facilitate the economic interests that facilitated the types of lives that the working class wanted, which is general, which was, I want to raise my family, I want to send my kids to a good school, I want to live in a community that's safe, that has good hockey teams, I can send my kid to dance class or what have you. I use hockey teams for a reason, and but I think that's there. That's exactly right. And it was trying to facilitate the type of lifestyle that your sort of everyday normal Canadian wanted. But if you look at the NDP and its commitments these days, it tends to be, let's just say, a little bit more campus oriented rather than shop floor oriented. And I think you're just seeing that across the board. And yeah, that's sort of the picture we're faced with right now. And I find it fascinating. It raises other questions, Sean and Rudyard, about what does that realignment look like, and how does a conservative party that has tended to be more market-oriented deal with that? And can we find some sort of fusion between support for organized labor and support for free market principles? I think there is a fusion. Mm-hmm. I think the question of whether or not that fusion is going to be made or is being made is something that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some of that in the energy sector, certainly with labor and indigenous groups getting, in a sense, a bigger share in projects and in the benefits that flow from them. And in other words, capital has to go kind of both ways. It can't just go to the owners of capital. It has to go to the people that make that capital real. I want to ask you a somewhat political question, which is, do these endorsements matter? I mean, when you have the pipe fitters or one of these big groups coming out, like I'm just so clueless as to how the actual mechanics of the labor movement work politically. Does this matter? Does it trickle down? Are members like, I don't know, yes, I've got a union membership, but it's kind of like my YMCA card, and I could, I'll open their newsletter, but it has about as much impact or influence on me as any other of the associations or groups that I belong to in my life.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, first of all, there is a not a clear line between what the union says and what the union worker actually votes for. But I will say the data show that the union worker is voting blue, that just generally almost across the board, the working class, which Sean and Cardis and others have defined as those who are working without a tertiary degree or a license, so people in PSWs and so on, they've tended to vote blue for quite some time. And so you're saying, okay, well, big deal. They were going to vote anyway. Why would they do that? There are a couple of things that I think do matter. One is, as you guys know, you guys are the political campaign experts, but I do know that there's such a thing as an air game. It helps if you're in the news saying, look at this big group of people, and look at 4,500 people support us, and you can show those pictures, you can show that support, and you can have that message out. I think that does send a signal to Canadian voters about who's caring for whose concerns. So I think that does matter in terms of the air game. Then also, when it comes to campaigns, our friend Ginny, who was on earlier this week, will talk about the ground game. Who's knocking on doors? Who's putting up signs? Who's answering phone calls? Who's driving people to get out the votes? That, for sure, is something that the unions, and particularly the building trades unions that are supporting the Conservatives right now, they're capable of doing that. They have done that. They seem to be done that in the Ontario election. So it does matter. I think it does matter. The money doesn't matter as much as it used to, given the change in campaign financing. But I think on both the air game and the ground game, it matters. And I think there's also a bit of a cultural thing there that
Yes.
if you're talking to a plumber who's at the hockey game and you're chatting like, well, who are you going to vote for? This person will often say that and say, oh, I saw my boss, or not my boss, but our union rep says this, and we're doing that. I think there's a bit of that. It does matter. And of course, it matters for a governing coalition and what the law will look like. And I think that's where the big question comes. Yeah, I look forward to seeing what happens there.
Uh, it's obvious, Brian, that the Conservatives see these trends as an opportunity, a way to expand the party's voter coalition. But are you worried at all, Brian, about the rise of educational polarization or political polarization based on the types of occupations people do? Here at the Hub, we've been thinking a lot about generational or intergenerational fault lines in the country. It's something, no doubt, that we'll talk about later today with David Coletto from Abacus. But why don't you just reflect on the potential risks of an electorate that is polarizing along educational lines?
Yeah, I think the risk is that you have governments that will pay attention to the one class and sort of suit their needs and forget about the needs of the other people. I think to be honest, quite honest, Sean, I think we have seen that at the federal level. On a whole variety of policies, and I'll just use childcare as a classic example. The Liberals' national daycare program, so-called national daycare program, they call it $10 a day, but it's just functionally not the fact anywhere, and it's at least a more waitlist than anyone else. But that's a program designed by and for the educated white collar class. And so
Yes.
a classic example of that is if you're a lawyer or if you're somebody working in banking or HR downtown Toronto, the policy that provides the entirety of the federal commitment to childcare to licensed not-for-profit cares, which is the government's preferred type, just happens to be the only one that is used by those people and not barely at all used by PSWs or dental hygienists, people who are using shift work. And so what happens is the voter coalition in some way shapes the policy, and the policy will reinforce certain trends about who gets what type of help. And I think I have concerns about that. The childcare program is the classic example. My sister, who's a dental hygienist, sort of a working class, she's not making tons of money, she's doing okay. She gets zero support from the federal government when it comes to childcare, zero support. And a lawyer working downtown or an academic who's working on some sort of big file tech in the new economy or what have you, gets all the support. And I think that's a problem. I think what we want to see are politicians who actually have aligned to those people who understand those needs and can craft policy, whether it's education policy, childcare policy, training policy, you name it, that actually helps ensure that roughly 30% of the population isn't left behind. And I think if you have concerns about equity, and a lot of that tends to be the language of the left, and then you look at the policies, it doesn't really back it up. So that's, I think, a challenge, and I think something that maybe you sort of counterintuitively the Conservatives could actually make a change if they can bring that into power with them.
Just as we wrap up with you, Brian, engage with us in some rank political punditry. What do you think of these NDP numbers? We were just looking at that poll, 6%. I mean, they're 1% off the block, which is a regional party. This is a national party, a historic party, going back to the CCF at 6%. Do you think did you expect ever to see numbers this low for the NDP? And again, how do you explain that? Is it partly a bleed to Conservatives on the part of working class Canadians, as we've just talked about? Is it, I don't know. Again, it's Sean and I are kind of scratching our heads as to how a lot of these NDP voters square the circle in terms of voting for Mark Carney, given his policy preferences.
Well, I want to say one thing up front. The CCF is dead. The CCF does not exist pretty much at all in the NDP anymore. That is a thing that has been buried deep in the prairies and has sent up a few shoots a few shoots of wheat. It really there are a few people who remain there, but the sort of election of Jack Layton over Bill Blakely, it was sort of that was the turning point. And you look in vain for an NDP supporter, and they are there. I have a few friends who are close and who wished their party would be that way, but it's just not there anymore. And so if you're going to compete for the campus vote, you're going to compete for the union private sector, or sorry, the public sector union vote.
Got it.
If you're going to compete for highly idiosyncratic issues, you're going to have a highly idiosyncratic polling numbers, and I think that's what you're getting, 6%. And to be honest, the Liberals under Trudeau effectively ate the NDP's lunch. Trudeau's government was as far left as you could imagine it being. Many people have said it was our sort of first NDP prime minister. Carney is signaling to the right, is sort of a return to the Paul Martin side, but he's surrounded by all the same people who, on questions of national identity, on questions of military support, on you name the issue, are still the same people. And so, in many ways, the NDP has just sort of said, well, this seems to be the left party that can get something done. Jagmeet Singh has been an utter disaster as far as leadership is concerned. I met him when he was a politician in Ontario. He was very, very shrewd, very good, but he has just been not a very good political operator. And I think that's the challenge here. And as Sean said, there's a bit of magic there. And at some point, the question is, are people going to see through the illusion, or is it illusion? And we don't really know that yet. And that's about as far as I'll go on my
we
ranked
appreciate it.
political
Look, it's
punditry.
early in this campaign. Brian, we're taking live questions to our email live stream at thehub.ca. We've also got people coming into the chat. Thank you. We've got a question for you right now coming into email. So I'm going to throw over to my colleague, Elia Gross, who's going to read that question to us, and we'll get you to respond.
All right. A question from Harry. He's wondering, what would it take for conservative support to move not just within the private sector unions, but also into public sector unions as well?
Thank you, Harry, for that question. So, Brian, what's your answer?
I think there's a snowball's chance in hell of that happening, if I want to be blunt. I think that's the challenge. Actually, what's happening is a great question, Harry, and I think what it raises is a point that we haven't really talked about, which is we can't forget that some of these alignment questions are pure interest questions. Okay, yes. So the NDP tends, and the Liberals tend to get public sector support because if you look at the if you're a union and you get your dues from the members, the number of members that are working in your environment and who are working hours in that environment, you say, well, who's going to give us the most hours? And in that case, you look at the Liberal track record on hiring civil servants, the public service, it has absolutely ballooned under them. And so you can see why there's just a pure interest in organizations like PSAC or CUPE or other public sector unions. They're like, okay, these guys are just buttering our bread and we're going to support them. And we like to say, okay, that's the left, and that's just sort of rank hypocrisy. But the fact is, it's also true on the right. And this is a question that we're going to want to keep an eye on. Places like the plumbers unions and so on are supporting conservative parties, particularly in Ontario, because they're getting lots of goodies from them. And things like training funds, the Skill Development Fund in Ontario is a massive cash cow for union training centers, which are, employ a lot of people and actually run a lot of money through the unions. Some of the competitiveness issues that Ontario has failed to advance, competitive tendering and infrastructure, for instance, that's a pure interest question. And it raises the question of whether conservatives are able to actually put forward a vision that respects the rights of organized labor, understands that organized labor is in many ways a small government thing. It's actually allowing civil society to take care of workplace issues rather than expanding the state to make greater employment standards acts and have more bureaucrats to do that, while maintaining free market stuff that's going to grow productivity. I'd say in Ontario, politically, that's been an absolute massive success. When it comes to competitiveness and when it comes to actually finding that fusion and that vision, it's been a mixed bag, and I'd say increasingly tending towards just an interest-based question. Ontario hasn't grown in terms of productivity. There's lots of stuff. Sean, I did a paper for you at the Monk School a while ago on reforming apprenticeship systems and so on. There's all kinds of low-hanging fruit. Ontario's done nothing on that. And so it's a question. They're not really taking or actually fusing conservative principles that would respect a free association of people with a productive market. I think those two things are completely compatible. A high view of labor, which I have at Cardis, a high view of organized labor, and a growth of that. I'd actually like to see more of that. While maintaining free market principles. Those things are totally compatible, but we haven't thus far had the leadership from conservative parties to put that policy vision forward.
Yeah, let me just jump on that, Richard, because it's a point I think worth underscoring for our audience. I'm as enthusiastic as anyone about the political realignment and the potential it represents for center-right parties to bring new and different voters into their fold and have those voices reflected in their policy priority setting and so on. But that process is a long road. It's about building relationship. It's about coming to understand the interests and preferences, sometimes even the language of voters. Think of it in a way as similar to the work that Jason Kenney did for years, building inroads into the different communities of new Canadians. Sometimes there's an instinct on the part of conservative politicians to try to take the short path. And that comes in the form of these union endorsements, as you say. But I think it's worth remembering that one of the key reasons that the realignment's happening at all, why working class voters are shifting to the right, is they're not just disillusioned with the failures of the parties of the left, they're disillusioned with their unions themselves. And so I think it's crucial to understand the realignment represents an opportunity, but just entering into these type of elite arrangements with the leaders of unions may actually counterintuitively not deliver the type of political progress you want, and as Brian says, actually produce policy outcomes that are harmful to the economy as a whole and arguably even harmful to the interests of these people. And so I guess it's a long way of saying, these endorsements are notable. It's why we're talking about them. But I think the longer term work of incorporating these ideas and voices into a conservative agenda will be the real test of the kind of durability and the success of the political realignment.
Brian, let's give you the last word as we wrap up again an important discussion on unions and organized labor early on in this campaign.
Great. The union guy loves having the last word, so let's do it. No, and I actually what I want to do is map out the potential for what could and I think should happen would be beneficial, right? Like unions are used to negotiating. We do this all the time, and as much as they're banging on about the employer, most unions that they're pretty practical, they're pretty pragmatic, and they know that there's a deal to be made, and not a deal in the sort of Trumpian sense of we'll make it and then we'll screw you over. They understand that there's a long-term relationship, and for all the chat about unions being hostile to employers, most of them know that. I think the party that is drawing their support should actually lean into that a little bit and say, okay, we're going to make a deal with you. We are going to provide some things that are in your interest, but we've got to get some things that work in everyone's interest as well. So let's just take Ontario, for example. There is a massive investment in skills development. That is a fantastic piece of policy. We are short on workers. The Ontario budget is $100 billion over 10 years, whatever the number is actually. And federally, we need tons of infrastructure as well. If we're going to build these pipelines that we need to make our world more productive, our country more productive and less reliant upon American trade, get our products to market, we're going to need the people to build them. If we're going to have the houses that we need to have to live in to grow to make sure kids like mine are able to go there, we got to have people to build them. So investing in skills training is fantastic, and working through the unions is a great way to do that. What we should be doing, though, what the government should be doing is making a deal and saying, look, we are going to give you this much. We are going to focus, we're going to run that money through you. But what we need are some things from you that make it more competitive. Basic competitiveness on infrastructure is a classic one. Energy, on electricity, on all kinds of things, you name it. Working with some of the regulations that were built in 1963 and which are hampering our ability to get people into the trades and skilled up so they can build that stuff. That's the type of negotiation that can happen. That's the thing that can respect the rights and the value that unions bring while also achieving some of that more free market oriented dynamic view of the economy. And frankly, I'm looking for that. I think that that's the thing that's going to make the difference between an actual realignment where conservatives do something with this, or just a shift from one side of loyalties to the other in this sort of pure sort of mafioso type of game that we've seen with the left in the past.
Yeah, horses, heads, and beds. Let's stay away from that. One of my favorite movies. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's important that we do talk about labor. It doesn't happen enough, frankly, in our conversations, especially on the center right of the political spectrum. So you bring a ton of analysis, a ton of insight. Thank you so much for coming on the program today.